In the year 897, Pope Stephen VI dug up a corpse. Specifically, the corpse of his recent predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had died 9 months earlier. What did he do with that corpse, you may ask? Well, nothing too weird. All he did was put it on trial, like in court. As you do. This is the story of two popes, a bit of grave robbing, and the struggle for papal power. I'm your host, RJ McLaughlin, and this story is weird. Welcome to the History Show. Now, before we get into the juicy dead pope on trial stuff, here's a bit of background to help set the stage. According to Catholic tradition, the papacy, which is what we call the office and authority of the pope, can be traced back to the earliest years after Jesus' death at around 30 CE. In those early days, and officially in the 2nd century, the pope was simply considered the Bishop of Rome, which for the record, he still technically is. At the time, being the spiritual leader of Rome wasn't quite the heavyweight title it would later become. Other major cities like Alexandria and Antioch also had influential bishops, and for a while, all were considered more or less equal in terms of religious authority. But Rome had something the others didn't, and that was the Apostle Peter. If you don't know anything about Catholicism, Peter is a big deal. He was an important one of Jesus' apostles and is now considered to be the first pope. And what's important here is that after his death, Peter was widely believed to have been buried in Rome. This led to the foundation of the patron theory, the idea that Jesus appointed Peter as head of the church and that this authority was passed down through the bishops of Rome. However, this tradition likely developed because Rome was trying to justify its importance. As the city's political clout declined, religious leaders framed Peter's legacy to their advantage, calling him the leader of the apostles and themselves his successors. Simply put, it was Peter that made Rome powerful, but Rome's grasp for power that made Peter central to the story. With this mentality and public perception, by the Middle Ages, when the story goes down, the Bishop of Rome was no longer just a bishop. He was the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. So jumping into the 800s, the Pope had real spiritual authority. Like, he could excommunicate people and make decisions on religious doctrine and beliefs, but politically speaking, he was in a tough spot. You see, Italy was fractured, and with the looming threats from the nearby Byzantine Empire, the Pope needed to make allies and align the papacy with the right people to gain the right protection. Still, the Pope wasn't just any old schmo off the street. As the leader of the church, he carried, and still carries today, a lot of influence over people's moral and spiritual lives. And in a world where divine approval matters a lot, he carries serious symbolic weight, meaning the Pope's blessing could elevate and bring legitimacy to a ruler's regional claim for power. Take the largely symbolic title of Emperor, or what we would later call Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope got to bestow his blessing on this position, starting with Charlemagne on Christmas in the year 800 CE. And while the Pope's endorsement didn't grant sweeping control over Europe, it did signal that a ruler had the backing of the church, which was huge at the time. And in a fragmented, chaotic landscape like 9th century Italy, that kind of symbolic clout could mean the difference between being viewed as an imposter or a divinely sanctioned ruler. Now, beneath the emperor, you've got all kinds of powerful players, noble families like the Dukes of Spoleto, influential Roman aristocrats, and rival branches within the Carolingian dynasty, all vying for influence by trying to control who sits on the papal throne, and therefore who controls much of the continent. And in the mid to late 800s, when our story actually begins, all those factions were competing to exert influence over the papacy in order to advance their political agendas in the surrounding papal states. Now let's start off with the Carolingian faction. The Carolingians were once the undisputed heavyweight champion rulers of Western Europe under the Emperor Charlemagne. However, by the late 9th century, due to shifts in power along with infighting, the dynasty was fading and struggling to keep its grip on the power it once had. The Dukes of Spoleto, meanwhile, were a powerful aristocratic family put in control of a region of central Italy, specifically the Duchy of Spoleto, located just a couple days' ride northeast of Rome. Now, they weren't emperors, but they were serious regional players with a growing influence over the papacy. By the mid-800s, they were acting independently, positioning themselves as the protectors of Rome. For both the Carolingians and the Spoletans, getting the Pope on their side was a huge deal. It meant you could boost your claim to power, line up key allies, and shape how people viewed them. Again, it gave you legitimacy, especially in places like France and the Germanic kingdoms. So these factions schemed and maneuvered constantly to get a pope who was sympathetic to their causes. But when influence and negotiations didn't work, things could still fall apart quickly. As you can imagine, all this scheming led to a fair bit of instability, and one of the clearest signs of this was the papal turnover rate. To put it into perspective, over the past 2-ish centuries, the average length of a pope's time in office has been somewhere around 14 years, and between 1922 and 2022, there have been 8 popes. But just between the years 800 and 900, the same length of time, there were 21 popes. Now, not all turnover was violent back then. Most of these popes died under natural causes. But even accounting for a lower life expectancy, that's still a striking amount of turnover. A few were deposed, some died under suspicious circumstances, but nearly all had to navigate intense political pressure just to stay in office. In short, being pope in the 9th century was not a long-term gig. And right in the middle of this revolving door of popes was a man named Formosus, the soon-to-be corpse of our story. Formosus had a long history with the church. Some good, some, let's call it, politically messy. He started off as Cardinal Bishop of Porto, one of the dioceses just outside of Rome, where he built a strong reputation as a skilled diplomat. He was also sent to Bulgaria as a papal legate, where he did such a good job they literally asked the sitting pope if Formosus could become their archbishop. This, however, started to ruffle some feathers, or vestments, if you will, back in Rome. Not only was it against canon law to abandon your original bishopric, but it also made him look a little too ambitious. Now, Pope Nicholas I, who had originally sent him to Bulgaria, seemed to trust him, but the request to make Formosus a bishop there was ultimately denied, and then denied again under the next pope, and that was that. Until 8 years later under Pope John VIII, where things took a turn. Formosus was sent as an envoy or messenger to Charles the Bald, the King of West Francia and grandson of Charlemagne. Now, somewhere along this process, tensions began to rise between Pope John VIII and Formosus, possibly because Pope John VIII viewed Formosus as a political rival. Seeing this, Formosus just dipped. He was out of there, and in reaction, in 876 CE, Pope John VIII accused Formosus of conspiring to usurp the papacy, which just means to take over, abandoning his original bishopric without permission, and stirring political unrest, all of which were serious violations that had him excommunicated from the church. But don't worry, remember that high papal turnover rate? After the death of Pope John VIII, Pope Marinus I was elected, and things started to look up for Formosus. While John had lifted the sentence of excommunication after Formosus swore an oath never to return to Rome or serve as a priest again, it was Marinus who released him from this oath. After being brought back into the church, Formosus quickly rose in popularity, especially among those who aligned themselves with the pro-Carolingian faction, who saw him as a steady, loyal figure in their corner. With the Spolitans controlling much of central Italy and threatening the independence of the papal state, Formosus' support for the distant Carolingians wasn't just about loyalty, it was about strategy. By aligning himself with a power far removed from Rome, he and his allies were resisting the growing Spolitan grip on papal politics. And this strategy turned out to be a pretty popular one. Fast forward 2 popes later, in 891, Formosus himself was elected pope by unanimous decision. Despite his earlier scandal, he had something that mattered more: alliances. The Roman clergy saw him as experienced, the nobility as a trusted diplomat, and the pro-Carolingian faction saw him as someone who would push back against the growing Spolitan influence in Rome. Once in office, Formosus was pretty much immediately faced with one of the most consequential decisions of his papacy: who to endorse and eventually crown as the next Holy Roman Emperor. Now, I'm gonna skip over some of the intrigue here, but essentially, there was a Spoleto pick, Lampert, who had already been crowned co-Holy Roman Emperor with his father, and a Carolingian pick, Arnulf of Carinthia. Formosus essentially had to decide if he was pro-increasing Spolitan control of the papal states, or if it was better to choose Arnulf and keep the papacy independent. Now, there may have been some possible side deals and invasions requested, but in the end, Formosus crowned Arnulf the Holy Roman Emperor in 896 CE. And then Formosus died. Talk about leaving when the going gets tough. Obviously, the Spolitans were super mad. In their eyes, the Pope just handed power to a foreign invader, humiliated their lineage, and stole their claim to the throne. This was unforgivable, and as we'll find out, not even death could stop them from getting revenge. Now, we don't know for sure how Formosus died. Some say illness, others say the stress of it all. He was also 80, so there's that. Regardless, the Spolitans saw their opening. For years, they had been locked in a back and forth struggle with Formosus, but with him gone, they finally had the opportunity to reassert their control and get their revenge. Now, there was a small hiccup when Pope Boniface VI was elected in April of 896 CE, but remember what I said about these guys playing dirty? Just 15 days after his inauguration, Boniface conveniently died, officially of gout, but some sources suggest that with how much was riding on this moment, the Spolitan faction or its affiliates might have helped speed things along. Regardless, with Boniface out of the way, the path was clear. They could now destroy the legacy of Formosus. Enter Stephen VI, a Roman son of a priest and reluctant bishop of Anagni. Backed by Lampert and the Spolitans, Stephen became pope in 896, and he is more than willing to deliver on the revenge Lampert craved in return. So naturally, Pope Stephen VI did what any rational religious leader would do in this situation. He had the 9-month-old corpse of his predecessor dug up from his grave. 'Cause that's normal. He then dressed Formosus in papal robes and threw him on trial. The charges: perjury, violation of canon law for serving as bishop in 2 places, Porto and Rome, which at the time was technically forbidden, and illegally becoming the pope. Now, all these charges did have some validity to them, but you might say that once you're dead, the point is kind of moot. And so began the Cadaver Synod, synod meaning a trial within the church. It was the definition of political theater in one of the most grotesque ways imaginable. It was designed to not only humiliate Formosus' supporters, but to erase his legacy altogether. In January of 897, the Cadaver Synod began, and Formosus, who had been dead for 9 months, was propped up on a throne inside the Roman Basilica. Roman clergymen and church officials looked on as this grotesque trial unfolded. Overseeing the proceedings was Pope Stephen VI, who appointed himself as judge, obviously, and speaking on behalf of the corpse was a lower-ranking deacon, who we have no information on. Could you imagine this guy just standing next to a body that's been dead for 9 months? Like, just think of the smell. How would you get anything done? I can barely focus when I burn my popcorn in the microwave, and these guys are cross-examining a corpse like it's another Tuesday? Objection, Your Holiness, leading the corpse. I don't think he could do anything other than plead the fifth. Unfortunately, we don't actually know how the trial went down. We do think that there may have been an earthquake that shook the room in what some called a clear sign from God, but if it was a sign, Stephen VI paid no attention to it. And even though we may not know much of what was said during the trial, as the records would later be burned, and even if they didn't, I don't know Latin, we do know the verdict. Guilty on all counts, obviously. After the conviction, Pope Stephen VI's men ripped off Formosus' papal robes, cut off his 3 blessing fingers, and as if that wasn't enough, dragged his body through the streets of Rome past stunned citizens and threw him into the Tiber River. A final insult meant to erase him from memory. But ironically, it did the exact opposite. While all these rich and powerful men argued over a corpse, they'd overlook something really important. A group arguably even more powerful than they were: the rest of Rome. Not just the Roman public, but key figures within the church as well. All were distraught and outraged at this horrific sight. Now, the Roman people had a pretty high tolerance for wild stuff happening at this point in time. I mean, these people lived through full-on sieges and were no strangers to physical attacks against the Pope. But dragging the 9-month-old corpse of the former Pope through the streets and throwing him into a river after putting his exhumed body on trial, that was a monstrous thing to do, even by Roman standards. Public opinion quickly shifted against Stephen VI, and what was supposed to look like a strong display of power ended up looking like the troubled vendetta of an evil man. Rumors began to spread that Formosus' mutilated corpse had washed ashore and was resurrected and performing miracles, a sign many believed to be divine vengeance, which sounds pretty sick. Riots erupted across Rome, fueled by the outrage of the Cadaver Synod. Stephen VI, once sitting smugly on his papal throne, was suddenly the most hated man in the city. The people demanded justice, and not long after, Stephen VI was arrested, stripped of power, and thrown into prison, where, being a pretty unpopular guy, he didn't last long. After just a few months, he was found strangled to death in his cell. On top of this, the popes after Stephen ended up reversing everything he did, including declaring the Cadaver Synod null and void, reburying Formosis's body in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and as I mentioned earlier, burning all the records of the Synod. But surely they discussed the smell, right? Today, the Cadaver Synod is seen and remembered as one of the lowest, most surreal moments in papal history. It's become a symbol of what happens when the papacy, a role meant to serve faith and morality, is warped by politics. But it's so much more than that. It's a case study on power, how it corrupts, how it blinds, how it convinces people that digging up a corpse and putting it on trial isn't just reasonable, but it's necessary. What was meant to be a calculated move to erase the legacy of a rival became a grotesque display of how far people will go when power stops being a responsibility and becomes an obsession. But in the end, it didn't work because people had had enough and spoke up. Something to leave you with. With great power comes great responsibility not to dig up your rival and put them on a fake trial, or you might end up a corpse yourself. That's a quote from Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, with additions from me, your host, RJ McLaughlin. And I think it fits pretty well here. Thank you to everybody who helped make this episode. If you have any other buried historical stories you want us to dig up, let us know in the comments. If you see stories below that you like, you can upvote them and we'll add them to our ever-growing list of topics. Also, if you want to see more of what we're up to, you can join the Complexly newsletter by visiting complexly.com. I'm your host, RJ McLaughlin, and I will see you in the next episode.